Sisters, 1933. My grandmother named all her daughters after royalty in order of birth: Maria Theresa, Antoinette, Lorraine, and Eugenie. They had 4 brothers, but they were named after relatives, which the girls considered to be insignificant and lowering. They took it for granted that their mother had meant them for great things on the basis of this naming, but they didn't know, because she didn't say and they didn't ask her. She wasn't the kind of mother who confided in her children. She had her own troubles. Her husband had left her 3 times. Twice she took him back, but when he came to her the 3rd time, she refused. The only witness to this meeting was my mother, Lorraine, who was 5. The others were gone. She couldn't remember where. When Lorraine's father came, she wouldn't let him in because she didn't recognize him, but her mother came and opened the door. Later, when Lorraine told her sisters about it, they were disappointed that she hadn't heard anything except for her father's greeting. He had said, "Mrs. Dvorak, I'm back." He had been smiling. Their mother had said, "Lorraine, go to play in the yard," and she had gone, excited to be out by herself, which was never allowed. All her memories of this important event in their family history had to do with a game she had invented, which involved a glass jar full of rose petals she'd gathered, a home for the glittering Japanese beetles that ate holes in the rose leaves. She put 2 of them in the jar and pretended that they were married. She had found a 50-cent piece buried in the dirt under the rose bushes, and she had pricked her finger on a rose thorn. The beads of blood that oozed out had fascinated her, and she had licked each one as it emerged. Whatever had happened between her parents in the house, her father had driven away in his car and never came back. Lorraine, who was my mother, always called Lore or Lo, was the 2nd youngest. It was recognized in the family that their mother had favorites, a favorite son and a favorite daughter. The favorite son was Michael, who was so much older than Lorraine that he was married by the time she was 3, with a good job in the steel mills. The favorite daughter was Antoinette, always called Tony or Aunt, who was pretty and considered to be delicate. Maria, called Maria, was the oldest girl, 10 years older than Eugenia, Jeannie, the youngest. They were sandwiched between their brothers, 3 older and the youngest, the baby boy who died, and this embattled position made them draw together despite the age difference. Their older 3 brothers married women who immediately got pregnant. They loved their nieces and nephews mostly, and they got along with their sisters-in-law. Maria graduated from high school and got a job in the garment factory, a short bus ride away from home. Aunt caught every disease that was going around, but in spite of her sickliness, she only grew prettier, with naturally curly auburn hair and big brown eyes. Jeannie had started school and had a crush on her teacher. Laura was 14. To save their honor, the neighborhood boys refused to play with her anymore. She could play with Jeannie and Aunt, but Jeannie was a baby and Aunt was a priss. She wasn't stupid enough to complain about any of this to her mother, but perhaps she divined it somehow, for one Saturday she told Laura that she had gotten her a job cleaning for a neighbor lady, Mrs. Dietz, the invalid wife who lived next door. Laura hadn't especially wanted a job, but none of the sisters, or the brothers either, ever said no to their mother or argued with her. To almost the end of her life she worked hard, and she expected them to do the same. She came to America from the Slovak part of Austria-Hungary with her husband and their 2 oldest children when she was 19. She had learned enough English to get by, but was never fluent, and the children eventually lost whatever of the language of the old country they knew. The girls knew only a few phrases. Sometimes she would tell them stories about her life there, her English peppered with Slovak words, about going to dances in the village square, how she and her sisters used beet juice to pink their cheeks and lips. But more often she restricted herself to careful sentences that were necessary for carrying on the business of life. My mother told me that she sometimes imagined that her mother had a store of words locked inside her, a crowd of stories and endearments, songs, jokes, none of which could be spoken now, that she was on the other side of this barrier, her children blithely speaking English on the other. Laura went over to the Dietz's house on that first Saturday. Mrs. Dietz received her in her bedroom. She came to know that Mrs. Dietz lived her life on the sofa or the bed, depending on how bad the day was. They were all bad days, but some worse than others. No one said what was wrong with her, but my mother figured out later that it must have been rheumatoid arthritis. The joints of Mrs. Dietz's fingers were grotesquely swollen, and her spine had curved so that she was always bent a little. On that first day, she asked Laura to come and stand right by the bed. She took Laura's hand and said that she had grown into a likely-looking girl. "You do well in school?" she asked. Laura said yes, for she did well enough, not as well as Maria, but better than Aunt. "Smart," Mrs. Dietz said to her husband, who was hovering in the doorway. The room smelled of something sharp, which might have been medicine or tea, and also of perfume. Mrs. Dietz was wearing a satin bed jacket, and instead of a quilt on her bed, she had a green satin duvet. Her hair, which was turning white, was in 2 braids, which lay on her skinny chest. Laura wondered how she could have done it with those swollen, twisted fingers. Mr. Dietz must have done it for her, she realized, and somehow this made her blush. Her duties were to clean the house every week on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Mr. Dietz did anything that was necessary daily, the dishes and the cooking and so forth. Mrs. Dietz gave him a loving look as she said this. But he couldn't be expected to do more. It wasn't fair to him. Oh, these men, Mrs. Dietz said. Can you imagine if he had to wash the floor? She laughed, a rusty little trill that went up and then down. Laura nodded. The things she would do were no more than the sort of chores she did at home, where she did more than her share of them, she believed, since Aunt often was excused for being delicate, and Jeannie for being the baby. Also, she would be getting paid. She would hand over most of it to her mother. She knew this without being told, since she'd seen her brothers giving their pay to her mother for years before they got married, and now Maria. But some of it would be hers, and she had already started to make a mental list of what she would buy. When she went home, Maria called to her to come to her room. Aunt and Jeannie were there, and they all lay down together on Maria's bed, something they had been doing for years, for when Jeannie was a baby and their mother had laid her down between them, admonishing them to watch her while she made dinner. Maria had her own room now that the brothers were gone, but Laura shared with Aunt and Jeannie. Officially, she envied Maria, although secretly she wasn't sure she'd like sleeping alone. How was it? Maria asked when they were comfortable. And what was Mrs. Dietz's like? Aunt said. Maria pulled open the drawer of the little table by her bed and handed around bullseyes. What do you have to do? Said Jeannie. She hadn't done anything yet, Laura told them. After Mrs. Dietz had talked to her, Mr. Dietz had walked her around the house, showing her the rooms and saying what needed to be done. He opened a cupboard with cleaning supplies and rags and took her down to the basement, which smelled like soap and mildew. He pointed to the wringer washer. Do you know how to operate this machine? He asked. Laura had said yes. She had never done it herself, but she'd watched her mother and Maria do it. When she said this to Maria, Maria made her face serious. Don't get your arm caught in the rollers, she said. They'll flatten it out like a pancake. Jeannie shrieked. She was an impressionable girl. Don't be stupid, Aunt said. It will stop if something big gets in it. Maminka told me. True, Maria said, but don't get your hair caught. It won't stop for that. At dinner that night, her job was discussed. Laura gave the list of duties and told how Mr. Dietz had taken her around the house. When Laura brought up the duvet and the bed jacket, her mother clucked her tongue. You don't talk about that house. She added something in Slovak that none of them, except perhaps Maria, understood. Mrs. Dietz is a good woman, she added. Laura hadn't thought that she was, so why bring it up? Was it because she didn't do her own housework? They all knew their mother valued hard work. It was one of the things that had ruined her marriage, that her husband, their father, couldn't or wouldn't keep a job. He had had so many, barman, dairyman, clerk, but none of them had stuck. Their mother had worked in her husband's business ventures and when they lived in Pennsylvania, ran a boarding house for minors. Now she was in her 50s with her older children helping out, but she still did fine washing and took in sewing and did light housekeeping for the parish priest. You don't talk about her, she said, and so Laura shut up. The next day was Sunday, and as they did every Sunday, their brothers came to dinner at 12 on the dot with their wives. A few of their friends from the mill came as well. There was a new baby to play with, Sharon. The sisters took her outside and put her on a blanket in the backyard. She had just learned to roll over, and every time she got to the end of the blanket, she made a face when she touched the grass. The men sat at the picnic table, drinking homemade beer. One of them, Curtis Beck, looked hardly older than Aunt or Laura, but he had a job in the blast furnace, and so was one of the men now. Laura looked up at one point and saw Mr. Dietz in his yard. He waved at her, and she waved back. It's your boss, Aunt said. The baby's mother wanted to know what she meant, and Laura's job was explained. You'll be making some money. That's nice, she said. Don't let him get fresh, though. A little silence fell, broken only by the baby's grunts as she tried to pull a button off Maria's skirt. What do you mean, Jeannie said, for she was the one who always asked the uncomfortable questions. Oh, you know, the baby's mother said. You know how men are. Mr. Dietz is not like that, Maria said. Maminka wouldn't let Laura go over there if he was. I'm sure, the baby's mother said, and then it was time for dinner, and they went in to sit at the table with all the leaves put in. My mother told me that she had known what her sister-in-law meant, of course. Things happened then as they do now, she said, except that it wasn't all over the news. I asked her if she was worried about it, and she said no. She was a stupid woman, her sister-in-law, she meant, and you could always count on her to say the worst thing, the thing that other people were too polite or kind to say. She was like that, and we learned not to pay attention to her. I don't know what Joseph saw in her. Laura's new job began the next Saturday at 9:30. Mr. Dietz needed time in the morning to get Mrs. Dietz ready, to face the day, as he said it. When Laura knocked on the door, he ushered her in to see his wife, something that would happen every time she arrived. She was sitting on the sofa this time, her feet up on a hassock. She was still wearing the bed jacket, but not her nightgown. She had on a pair of pants, brown corduroy, that went oddly with the fancy jacket. Laura wasn't used to seeing women in pants. Her hair was braided, as before, and her cheeks pinked with rouge, somewhat inexpertly applied. "Hello, dear," she said to Laura, and held her hand out to her. When Laura came forward to take it, she tugged her down to sit on the sofa. Laura looked at Mr. Dietz, who was hovering and smiling. "Should I get started?" "Willie wanted to have a chat," he said. My mother said that she thought at first that Willie was someone else, another man, but then realized that he meant Mrs. Dietz, and she seemed to see her confusion because she said, "It's short for Wilhelmine." And then, "Now, go away, Arthur. We're just going to be cozy here for a few minutes. Have a cookie, dear." The cookies were store-bought, animal crackers, but Mrs. Dietz didn't apologize for them as any other woman in the neighborhood would have. "Now, I don't want you to wear yourself out," Mrs. Dietz said. "Arthur made a list for you, but don't feel as if you have to do everything on it." She pushed the cookies toward Laura. "Do what you can. That's all anyone could do. It's what my father used to say. Watch the clock, and when it's 11, we'll have a nuncheon together. You'll find it on a plate in the icebox. Now, go." She fluttered her hands at Laura. The list was on a slate hung by the kitchen door. Wash floor, rinse out dish towels, dust furniture dining room, dust furniture front room, water plants, and so on. Laura kept her mind on what she was doing with some difficulty, for she was curious about the house. She wanted to open every drawer and cupboard to see what was inside. In the dining room, she wanted to pick up all the odd decorative items crowding the shelves and cupboards: shepherdesses, dogs, children dressed in ragged clothes, all made out of china, but also outsized pine cones, shells, miniature musical instruments, painted birdhouses, too many things to list. She dusted them all carefully with the feather duster Mr. Dietz had left for her, the first time she had used such a thing. In her mother's house, old clothes of an appropriate material were cut into rags for this purpose. She left the front room for last, since Mrs. Dietz was sitting there, and she felt shy of disturbing her or having to talk to her. But when she got there, she was surprised to find the sofa empty. Somehow she had had the idea that Mrs. Dietz couldn't walk. She had imagined Mr. Dietz carrying his wife everywhere. They all had seen him carrying her out to the porch in summer so that she could enjoy the warm weather. She hurried to dust the front room, careful to touch the keys of the piano lightly so as not to make a sound. She had never seen a piano in someone's house before. She dusted the rack and the book on it, opened to a song called "The Cubanola Glide," and then the sheet music stacked on the back of the instrument. There was a cabinet above it with more treasures in it, behind a glass-paneled door. As she hesitated, Mrs. Dietz said from behind her, "You don't have to bother with those. The dust can't get in." Mrs. Dietz was standing in the archway between the front room and the dining room, propped on two canes. Her body was twisted, her head trembling a little on the uncertain stalk of her neck. Laura stepped forward, instinctively feeling that she ought to support her or catch her if she fell, which seemed uncomfortably possible. Mrs. Dietz was smiling, though, and she came into the room, bracing herself at each step. "You've caught me, my dear," she said. "Sometimes I take a little walk around the house. Don't tell Arthur, though. He likes to think I don't stir a step while he's gone." It took her a full minute to walk the distance from the arch to the sofa. When she had lowered herself, she said, "It must be 11, don't you think? Why don't you go and see what Arthur has put aside for us?" Directed by Mrs. Dietz, Laura pulled up an armchair, and they sat across from each other. She filled a plate for Mrs. Dietz and then for herself. She hadn't been hungry, really, but the little cookies were irresistible, and before she knew it, she had eaten 5. "Now, tell me about your sisters," Mrs. Dietz said. "There are 4 of you, is that right?" Laura nodded, but didn't go on. She didn't know what to say. "How I've always envied your mother. Such a lucky woman, in spite of her troubles." "I was tongue-tied," my mother told me. "I had never sat down to have a conversation with an older woman who wasn't related to me, except for the teachers at school. That first time," she said, "it was all Mrs. Dietz asking questions about her sisters and brothers, her nieces and nephews, about school. She asked about my mother's grades, and when she said that she'd gotten all A's on her last report card, except in handwriting, Mrs. Dietz clapped her hands together carefully, as if it would hurt if she did it too hard. "You must bring it over to show me," she said, and when my mother explained that it went back to school after it was signed, she made her promise to bring the next one. When Laura went back home, her sisters were huddled around the kitchen table, eating kuchen and looking at a magazine Maria had brought home from work. Laura fixed herself a piece of bread with applesauce and sat down, enjoying the feeling of not having a chore. When their brothers had still lived at home, just so would they lie back in their chairs when they got off shift, legs stretched out, one foot cocked on another. And Maria now, when she got back from the knitting factory, their mother would tell one of the younger girls to bring her a glass of cool water or lemonade or a cup of coffee with a spoonful of cream. No one brought Laura anything, but she enjoyed it just the same. "How was the job?" her mother said. Was sounded like bus, and job like job. But Laura took no notice of it. This was just how their mother spoke, and many adults they knew as well, the consonants and vowels of the old country fighting with the English words. "It was easy," she said, "just easy things. They have a feather duster for dusting." Jeannie wanted to know what this was, and Laura explained, mimicking with her hand the airy movements she made when she used it. "The rag is better," her mother said. "But what anyone does in their own house, it's good." "You scrubbed?" "Mrs. Dietz said the kitchen floor didn't need it," Laura said. Her mother looked as if she might have said something about this, but it was getting time for dinner, and she went to bread and flour the pork chops. Their oldest brother was coming to dinner, and it was his favorite dish. That night, Maria joined the younger girls in their room to hear about Laura's job, and she told them everything she remembered. "I want to go and work there," Jeannie said, when Laura told them about the china figures and the beautiful plate of snacks. But Aunt declared that she wasn't interested in any kind of a job that involved more chores. "I'm going to get married," she said, "and I won't have to get a job." "What do you think married women do?" Maria said. "Cook and clean and scrub every day." "I'll have a maid," Aunt said, and they laughed at her, which made her mad. She went to the cot by the window and turned her back to them. "Don't be a baby," Maria said to her. "It's what we'll all do." Why, Jeannie wanted to know. But Laura started to hit Aunt with her pillow, and they all got into it until their mother called up the stairs in Slovak to stop their noise, "Zastavi hluk," and her question was never answered.